Mao's brand of Marxist socialism. I got cut off, so I'm going to tell you just a little bit about the Chinese Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, and the 5-year plans. Okay? So Mao was determined to reshape China's economy based on Marxist socialism. About 80% of the people lived in rural areas in China, but most owned no land. Instead, 10% of the rural population controlled 70% of the farmland of China. Under the Agrarian Reform Law of 1950, Mao seized the holdings of these landlords. His forces killed more than 1 million landlords who resisted. He then divided the land among the peasants. Later, to further Mao's socialist principles, the government forced peasants to join massive collective farms. Each of these farms was comprised of 200 to 300 households. Mao's changes also transformed industry and business. Gradually, private companies were nationalized or brought under government ownership. In 1953, Mao launched a 5-year plan that set high production goals for industry. And by 1957, China's output of coal, cement, steel, and electricity had increased really dramatically. What you're looking at there on the bottom, on the right, the visual to the right, I don't know if you can see it because it might be off screen. These are backyard furnaces in some of these communes used to make iron. The Great Leap Forward. To expand the success of the first 5-year plan, Mao proclaimed the Great Leap Forward in early of 1958. This plan called for still larger collective farms or communes, and by the end of 1958, about 26,000 communes had been created. The average commune sprawled over 15,000 acres and supported over 25,000 people. In a strictly controlled life of communes, peasants worked the land together. They ate in communal dining rooms, slept in communal dormitories, raised children in communal nurseries, and they owned nothing. The peasants had no incentive to work hard when only the state profited from their labor. The Great Leap Forward was actually a giant step backward. Poor planning and inefficient backyard or home industries hampered growth. The program was ended in 1961 after crop failures caused famine that killed as much as 20 million people. So China was facing external problems as well as internal ones in the late 1950s, and the spirit of cooperation that had bound the Soviet Union and the Chinese began to fade. Each sought to lead the worldwide communist movement. As they also shared the longest border in the world, they faced numerous territorial disputes. After the failures of the Great Leap Forward and the split with the Soviet Union, Mao reduced his role in government. Other leaders moved away from Mao's strict socialist ideas. For example, farm families could live in their own homes and could sell crops they grew on small private plots. Factory workers could compete for wage increases and promotions. Mao thought that China's new economic policies weakened the communist goal for social equality. He was determined to revive the revolution. In 1966, he urged China's young people to learn revolution by making revolution. Millions of high school and college students responded. They left their classrooms and formed militia units called the Red Guard. The Cultural Revolution. Last piece. The Red Guards led a major uprising known as the Cultural Revolution. Its goals was to establish a society of peasants and workers in which all were equal. The new hero was the peasant who worked with his hands. The life of the mind, intellectual and artistic activity, was considered useless and sometimes even dangerous. To stamp this out, the Red Guards shut down colleges and schools, and they targeted anyone who resisted the regime. Intellectuals had to purify themselves by doing hard labor in remote villages, and thousands were executed or imprisoned. Chaos threatened farm production and closed down factories, and civil war seemed possible. By 1968, even Mao admitted that the Cultural Revolution had to stop. The army was ordered to put down the Red Guards. Zhou Enlai, Chinese Communist Party founder and premier since 1949, began to restore order. While China was struggling to become stable, the Cold War continued to rage. 2 full-scale wars were being fought, in Korea and in Vietnam. The Red Guards were students, mainly teenagers, pledging their devotion to Chairman Mao. From 1966 to 1968, about 20 to 30 million Red Guards roamed China's cities and countryside, causing widespread chaos. They smashed the old non-Maoist ways of life, destroying buildings and beat and even killed Mao's alleged enemies. They lashed out at professors, government officials, factory managers, even their parents. Eventually, even Mao turned on them. Most were exiled to the countryside, others arrested, some were even executed. Which is kind of sad because they were manipulated by Mao in the first place. Okay, last little piece about Mao. So Mao was born into a peasant family. Hang on. There he is. Mao was born into a peasant family and embraced Marxist socialism as a young man. He began as an urban labor organizer, but he quickly realized the revolutionary potential of China's peasants. In 1927, Mao predicted, "The force of the peasantry is like that of the raging winds and driving rain. They will bury beneath them all forces of imperialism, militarism, corrupt officialdom, village bosses, and evil gentry." Mao's first attempt to lead the peasants in revolt failed in 1927, but during the Japanese occupation, Mao and his followers won widespread support by reducing rents and promising to redistribute land. Kind of like the Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata of Mexico, Mao was to China.
Democratic dictatorship. Oh, democratic dictatorships, you're the best. It's all the best parts of democracy and all the best parts of dictatorship. You get to vote, but there's only one choice. It takes all the pesky thinking out of it. The PRC promised equal rights for women, rent reduction, land redistribution, new heavy industry, and lots of freedoms, including freedoms of thought, speech, publication, assembly, association, correspondence, person, domicile, moving from one place to another, religious belief, and the freedom to hold processions or demonstrations. Yeah, no. Even putting aside the PRC's failure to protect any of these rights, Mao's China wasn't much fun if you were a landlord, or even if you were a peasant who'd done well. Land redistribution and reform meant destroying the power of landlords, often violently. But centralizing power and checking individual ambition proved difficult for the government, and it was made harder by China's involvement in the Korean War, which helped spur the first mass campaign of Mao's democratic dictatorship. Designed to encourage support for the war, the campaign was called the Resist America and Aid Korea campaign, and it resulted in almost all foreigners leaving China. A second campaign against counter-revolutionaries was much worse. People suspected of sympathizing with the Kuomintang or anyone insufficiently communist was subject to humiliation and violence. Between October 1950 and August 1951, 28,332 people accused of being spies or counter-revolutionaries were executed in Guangdong City alone. A third mass campaign, the 3 Anti-campaign, was aimed at reforming the Communist Party itself, and the final mass campaign, the 5 Anti-campaign, was an assault on all bourgeois capitalism, which effectively killed private industry in China. Very few of the victims of this last campaign actually died, but capitalism was weakened and state control bolstered. Okay, let's go to the thought bubble. Mao and the CCP set out to turn China into an industrial powerhouse by following the Soviet model. We haven't really talked about this, but under the Soviet system, Russia was able to accomplish massive industrialization, not to mention tens of millions of deaths from starvation, through centralized planning and collectivization of agriculture, following what were known as 5-year plans. The Chinese adopted the model of the 5-year plans beginning in 1953, and the first one worked, at least as far as industrialization was concerned. In fact, the plan worked even better than expected, with industry increasing 121% more than projected. In order for this to work, though, the peasants had to grow lots of grain and sell it at extremely low prices. This kept inflation in check, and saving was encouraged by the fact that the 5-year plan didn't have many consumer goods, so there was nothing to buy. For urban workers, living standards improved, and China's population grew to 646 million. So far, Mao's plan seemed to be working, but there was no way that China could keep up that growth, especially without some backsliding into capitalism. So Mao came up with a terrible idea called the Great Leap Forward. Mao essentially decided that the nation could be psyched up into more industrial productivity. Among many other bad ideas, he famously ordered that individuals build small steel furnaces in their backyard to increase steel production. This was not a good idea. First off, it didn't actually increase steel production much. Secondly, it turns out that people making steel in their backyard who know nothing about making steel make bad steel. But the worst idea was to pay for heavy machinery from the USSR with exported grain. This meant that there was less for peasants to eat, and as a result, between 1959 and 1962, 20 million people died, probably half of whom were under the age of 10. Jeez, thought bubble, that was sad. And then in happier news came the Cultural Revolution. Just kidding, it sucked. By the middle of the 60s, Mao was afraid that China's revolution was running out of steam, and he didn't want China to end up just a bureaucratized police state like, most of the Soviet bloc. And the Cultural Revolution was an attempt to capture the glory days of the revolution and fire up the masses. And what better way to do that than to empower the kids, frustrated students who were unable to find decent, fulfilling jobs the chance to denounce their teachers, employers, and sometimes even their parents, and to tear down tradition, which often meant demolishing buildings and art. The ranks of these Red Guards swelled, and anyone representing the so-called four olds, old culture, old habits, old ideas, and old customs, was subject to humiliation and violence. Intellectuals were again sent to the countryside, as they were in 1942. Millions were persecuted, and countless historical and religious artifacts were destroyed. But the real aim of the Cultural Revolution was to consolidate Mao's revolution. And while his image still looms large, it's hard to say that China these days is a socialist state. Many would argue that Mao's revolution was extremely short-lived, and that the real change in China happened in 1911. That's when the Chinese Republic ended 3,000 years of dynastic history and forever broke the cyclical pattern the Chinese used to understand their past. I mean, at least in some senses, those nationalist revolutionaries literally put an end to history. That sense of living in a truly new world has made many great and terrible things possible in China. The legacy of China's two revolutions is mixed at best. China, for instance, made most of the camera we're using to film this video, and China made most of the computers we use to edit it. But no one in the People's Republic of China will legally be able to watch this video, because the government blocks YouTube. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is tradition directed by Stan Muller. Our script supervisor is Meredith Danko. Our associate producer is Danica Johnson. The show is written by my high school history teacher, Raoul Meyer, and myself, and our graphics team is Thought Bubble. Last week's